All right, so we'll get going right away. So unfortunately, my guest could not come tonight. So it's too bad, but there's a lot going on right now, so I can understand that. So I'm going to um, talk about for those that are taking 586, we're wrapping things up. So I kind of want to paint a continuum of like where things have been and where things are going, kind of in terms of sustainable development. And then for those that are in 322, which is a new class that's come online, this will just give you a little more kind of, a history lesson, and then also kind of explain what's happening at this moment right now, and then where things most likely are going to go in the rate. The big thing here that I want you to walk away with is time. Is the time at which things are happening, why things happened over time, and then what is going on right now and what is likely to happen going forward. All right, that's kind of what I want to get across today. All right, so I'm going to talk about the past and future of environmental assessment and sustainable development, and that's about it. So the source. Now, I mean, for 586, we haven't necessarily been talking about environmental assessment, although we've been dealing with kind of using models and so forth by looking at breaking down situations and assessing environmental problems as they link to social and economic factors. So it does relate to environmental impact assessment and environmental management. So the whole idea behind conservation, although it's these days, especially when you look at the emphasis on climate change, it's there's a lot of attention being paid to these issues now, more than I think ever, really. But conservation is not really new. Like, it's been a practice of cultures throughout civilization. However, it tends to be, the pattern tends to be that it's not until really distinct environmental impacts present themselves that you really get traction on motivations for regulations and systems for managing them. So like back to, for those that are around, for present when Jim McTaggart-Cowan was the guest, I mean, he talked about why regulations came up. And although he was like the kind of that ran the first climate conference in Canada before the IPCC was even around, it's certainly taken a long time, 30 plus years, to get to the point where we have like a pan-Canadian climate plan and so forth. So it does sometimes take more time, but it really comes to a head when these issues become such a social imperative that there needs to be action. So the very root of humanity is humanity's concern for their health and the quality of nature. And I would say probably tends to be more the former than the latter. I think as soon as something becomes a public health concern, like COVID, for instance, or other things, say toxins in the environment and bioaccumulation and so forth, then things really move. So there's two kind of outlooks of typically how they classify things in the literature. It's ecocentric or anthropocentric. So like you could say right now, like a really strong ecocentric movement is the protests against old growth forest logging in Vancouver Island, which, I support those protests for the most part. And that's kind of like a putting in nature first type of approach, whereas anthropocentric tends to put kind of human needs before the environment. So we're kind of like, actually, in the environment field, we're attempting more and more these days to bridge those two. So even calling the current era we're in the Anthropocene, right? That speaks to how much we're staring into the reality that human beings have a pretty big impact, and we have to kind of deal with that and understand that that is not something that's going to go away. So practically speaking, environmental assessment, environmental impact assessment, and management tend to be more anthropocentric. I mean, they are dealing with, you wouldn't have EIA were it not for projects, right? For infrastructure and development projects. Similarly, you don't have environmental management systems or practices or programs or policies in the case of, say, the Alaska fisheries the situation, were it not for, you know, the human need for the resource, whether it be infrastructure or fishing and so forth. So right off the bat, you kind of need to be clear that a lot of our job is dealing with anthropocentric issues, and EIA and environmental management are not necessarily always about conservation and ecological integrity. However, it depends on how they are exercised. The intent can be in that direction. So where did this stuff come from? Like, what's the inspiration for this kind of thinking? Well, I mean, there's a lot really, but I'd like to highlight some that really pop out in the literature, and feel free to kind of give your opinion as well. And for environmental management issues, we can look to a lot of the development, at least in North America, coming from HDT, Henry David Thoreau, who was around from 1817 to 1862, who's an author, a naturalist, poet, transcendentalist. So has anybody read Walden before or know of that book? Just say so in the chat. Anybody? You know of the book, Walden? I know it, sure. Just bought it to read. Good, yeah. So it's, I mean, Walden's a classic. In fact, like, it's not the most gripping story, really. I remember I got it a long time ago, and because everybody always talked about it. Yeah, I mean, I would say get it, if just so you have it and read it, just so you've read it. But I don't think it's going to keep you on the edge of your seat. It's very kind of, you know, looking at a fundamental look at one individual's relationship and living off the land. And he's also, like, HDT was known as a kind of a political activist too, a bit of like a rebel. So interesting character. But I mean, really, he planted the seeds, at least in North America, for like deep ecology and that kind of thinking. Arne Naess in Europe was along those same lines. John Muir, another kind of eminent thinker, I guess you could say, in naturalism and conservation in North America. 1837 to 1914. John of the Mountains was his nickname. He's a naturalist, ecological thinker, spokesperson, and a political advocate for nature. Right. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard of John Muir before. At least the name. A lot of things are named after him. Aldo Leopold, known for the land ethics, professor, author, environmentalist, famous for environmental ethics. So if you've taken any ethics courses or philosophy courses, you would, I'm sure, have heard of Aldo Leopold before. More so on the conservation side of the equation, but actually he kind of like moved to the center as things progressed. And then Guilford Pinchot from 1865 to 1946 hiked the John Muir Trail, California. Yeah. Guilford Pinchot was a kind of a controversial character in some respects, certainly for the purists. Not kind of the, I wouldn't say that John Muir would be the biggest fan of Guilford Pinchot, but he was the first chief forester of the United States, an advocate of conservation through planned use and renewal. So very much more of like looking at forests as resources type of individual. Okay. So these aren't the only folks. I mean, there's an array, but in the North American context, these are some biggies that really influenced kind of policy, which is kind of what I want to talk about today. So these thinkers set the foundation for the emergence of environmental management in EIA and kind of the policy that we deal with today. The ethics, so the appreciation of the land, whether you're looking at it from a utilitarian or conservation standpoint, all of these folks, I would say, had a high degree of respect for the land. Now, how they kind of position what we should do with it, that's where they differed quite a bit. So, you know, like an HDT, conservation versus preservation, sure. Conservation versus sustainable use, if you want to look at it in modern context, you know, it would different types of kind of perspective. Like I would say that John Muir and HDT would certainly be more on the pure conservation side of the equation, whereas Aldo Leopold and Gifford Pinchot would be more on sustainable use, maybe, if you want to call that, however you want to phrase that, using the land in a way that can meet the needs of the economy, yet at the same time not degrade things. However, the Industrial Revolution had a pretty big impact on all of these ways of thinking about stuff. Industrial brought about a dramatic increase in social and economic development. Along with that came a significant increase in pollution as a result of industrial activity. So pre-industrial revolution, I mean, largely agrarian-based society and natural resource-based economies. So like mining, forestry, etc. But then the Industrial Revolution certainly kind of like brought a whole new kind of realm of economic development. So in North America at the time, limits to growth were not fully acknowledged, like unlike today where, we realize that there's limits to growth, at least I think we do. At that point in time, we're still this kind of like wide open, less population, wide open land. And like there's kind of, the limits to growth weren't as apparent as they are today, right? So global tipping points and all that kind of stuff was not even on the radar. So there was an inflection point, and that inflection point came in the 1960s. So specifically related to pollution. So knowledge of pollution impacts began to grow, particularly chemical impacts. That's the thing that really kind of, I would say, there was a critical tipping point for environmental policy in North America, if not the world. And in particular, chemical impacts on humans and the environment. So the threat to human health as a result of chemical pollution, chemical-based pollution. And in the same time in the 1960s, it was a time of like massive social change, a lot of liberation going on, women's liberation, anti-war movements, the civil rights movement, and advocacy in various different sorts. There we go. Yeah, Silent Spring is another classic. So, and during this time, this was really the birth of modern environmentalism, as I'd say it, certainly in North America, if not, I would say in the world. Yeah, it changed everything at that point in time. So Rachel Carson's book is entitled Silent Spring, was published in 1962. And this would be another one for everybody. I would recommend getting this book. It's one of those ones that it's constantly referred to. And it's one of those, it's just one of the ones you should either know about, go read it, or have it, I would say. Have a read of it. And really at the time, what this was about was the harmful effects of pesticides on the environment. That was really the motivation behind it. And see, Sarah is saying her writing is captivating. So, I mean, some people, described her writing as scientific knowledge married with poetry, like a poetic writing style, right? It's a good read. So I wouldn't say unlike Walden, but I mean, it will certainly be a little more enjoyable, I would think, to read than Walden, more engaging. So this book and the popularity of this book, really, and it's not the book itself, Leopold's writing as well is really nice. Like I would say he's a poet. And if you want to read another one, just as we're talking about good writing, is Menzies, who's a philosopher at UBC. So he's written a book, People of the Saltwater. So if you're interested in indigenous issues, read that book. Go get it tomorrow. It's great. Charles Menzies. Yeah. No, it's a fantastic book, like really beautifully written, and it's great. It's just all I got to say. It's a great book. Same idea. Though why I bring it up is it's written poetically. I find my feeling was, and it's very good. So, but back to Carson, it was like, this is an inflection point. I mean, this is where a lot of things changed, right? So that was a start, I would say. This is where kind of, I wouldn't say history started, but a lot of big things started in the 1960s, late 1960s. So social concern that was bubbling up in many different capacities, but particularly in this case pertaining to toxins in the environment, manifest itself on pressure on the government. And this is a theme, right? People get upset enough about an issue, then pressure gets pushed onto governments and democracies. And companies and governments needed to respond, right? So the companies were the big polluters, Dow being one. And so the response to that was NEPA. Actually, it's National Environmental Policy Act, I believe, not Protection Act. And NEPA was introduced in 1969 and passed into law in January of 1970. So that essentially was the first robust environmental regulation or law framework in North America, was NEPA. And that followed shortly thereafter in Canada in 1973 with a similar type of National Environmental Impact Assessment Act. Okay. And so the way that started, though, was NEPA stated that each new development had to address potential environmental impacts. It wasn't a broad, so this wasn't like a strategic environmental policy. It was focused on projects. Like if you're going to build a new dam, there needs to be an environmental assessment done for it, like a basically review. So at the first stage of it, you know, it wasn't super robust, but it was a start. So in the 1970s, each new project was required to produce what's called an EIS, an environmental impact statement, just to identify what the environmental effects, impacts, ways to manage or monitor and mitigate the effects were. And the process initiated at the national level, but evolved at the state level. So, I mean, in any jurisdiction, you got to see how the powers intersect. So in the states, you have federal policies and then state level policies. But a lot of those occurred at the state level. In Canada, we have provincial and federal regulations. At the same time as the EIA process, and so similarly in Canada, you had a project-based policy. So as new projects were proposed, there had to be an environmental impact statement produced. So concurrently at the same time as this EIA process, which is project-based, so this is for any project, and usually these are either done on government land or they have a major public impact. And there's a criteria that dictates when you need to do an environmental impact assessment and to what level you need to do it at. So at the same time, though, as this new policy, what dictates every new project needs to have an assessment done, environmental management actions were taking place. So the distinction between the two is environmental impact assessments are for projects, whereas environmental management programs are for organizations, right? So like an energy company will have an environmental management program. So environmental management programs started closely around the same time. And the first like chemical companies, because the chemical companies were some of the most vilified at this point in time. They were the ones who started really a lot of the first work in that area, pollution prevention, P2 being one, ISO 14001 being one that's followed that. So many of these companies quickly began to realize that they needed to get a handle on their emissions, and hence the evolution of environmental management systems. Chemical companies, Dow being one, were early movers. So Dow was actually one of the first companies to really try and get ahead of the issue. In Niagara, yeah, it's not surprising. Some cases, if you look at certain, there's certain hot spots. So Niagara was one, Sarnia is another one. Another good example would be in Sudbury, right? And Jim talked about Sudbury. And so I guess it would have been Inco at the time, the smelter, rather than close their doors back when acid rain became a big issue due to SOx and NOx emissions, they decided to innovate and take care of the issue. So if you ever get a chance to Google SOx, NOx, and Inco Sudbury, and to try and like look at the history, I mean, the reversal of that is phenomenal. Like they just kind of turned the corner like you wouldn't believe. And their output has still maintained, even to this day, is quite high, yet their emissions of harmful chemicals, SOx and NOx, which contribute to acid rain, are very, very low now. So that was the 70s. Yeah, I thought we're closing up in Sudbury. I don't know. I mean, well, it's not. Glencore is now one of the main facilities. Inco got bought out. I forget who it was, Vale or something like that. I'm not sure. I know the guy who's running that. He was on a. They're still active. I mean, they were on a panel I did. I can send you a link, actually. I'll tell you what, I'll send you a link to the circular economy panel I moderated in January, and the VP of Glencore was on that. So he'll talk all about what they're doing. He does, and that it's on YouTube. So in the 1980s, we had NEPA. This is where kind of people woke up a bit and said, okay, that's great. The government and companies start to pay attention to this stuff. However, many viewed EIAs through NEPA as simply permits to develop, simply because, in a lot of cases, the environmental assessments were approved after the project was completed. Often projects would be started without any EIA being approved. So the scope of the EIAs needed to really develop at this point in time, and more techniques were developed. So in this area of analysis, largely scientific based at this time, and this is where it kind of gets interesting for us, is that a lot of this stuff was all about the science at that point in time, and scoping to reduce the volume of analysis became a priority because, I mean, there was just so much to these. There's a large studies. And so, and this is also where I mentioned responsible care, or P2 and responsible care emerged in 1985. So this is like one of the first kind of standards that emerged for chemical companies. First systematic programs for managing environmental impacts in the chemistry and chemical industry. And scoping of EIA, so, started to see reports becoming more accessible because these were largely scientific reports that were not accessible and in fact like just super cumbersome. And we started to see in the 1980s, corporations started to communicate science more to the public at a very early stage, and more public involvement and impact or input on EIAs, and therefore more of an emphasis on social factors. Scale dependence also emerged at this point in time. This is something we've talked a lot about in 586. Not just about local impacts, but regional impacts. And a lot of that had to do with things like Inco and various other companies, the CFC impacts that were some of the larger scale issues. So say water quality in the Great Lakes, acid rain, ozone hole, etc., were obviously not a result of just one project here, but many different activities that were aggregating to have that effect. So this kind of like a broader view is starting to take place in the 80s. So into the 90s, brought the birth of what we know as current environmental management systems. So the first EMS standard was in 1992. This is called BS 7750. Eventually ISO 14000 emerged in the 1996, which is ISO, International Standards Organization, kind of the first globally recognized environmental standard that everybody subscribed to. In the 1980s and 90s, a series of major global issues. So we've talked about this. We had actually David Ainsworth from the CBD. This is where all the global stuff really started to bubble up. Ozone law, as Jim was talking about, acid rain. So how Mulroney had to act on acid rain with Reagan at the time. Sustainable development really started to emerge at this point in time as like a word, a phrase, as a result of the Brundtland Commission, and then also policies. So as David mentioned, it was in 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio, where the three Rio conventions, global agreements for biodiversity, climate change, and combating desertification, respectively, were created. I mean, they were conceived at that point in time, and they actually signed into law, or at least kind of became legal text in 1993. And this, a more broad environment view of the environment was starting to take place at this time. So those in sustainable development, when we talk about the economic and social imperative, we started to see how these things kind of fall into it. So social, demographic, cultural, economic aspects started to be introduced into this discussion. It wasn't just about toxins in the environment anymore. It was more about a broader perspective. And hence, with all the tools that go with that, such as environmental impact assessments and management tools, they started to be a little broader as well. Up until that point in time, they'd largely been scientific and technical documents and practices. So also in the 90s, systems thinking started to become more prevalent. I think a lot of what had to do with that was the evolution of technology and computer systems. So this kind of came into EIA and environmental management systems. So we started to look at the connectivity and the interconnectivity between issues, so like social and ecological systems, multiple scales, and then also qualitative and quantitative analysis. So early action also encouraged as a result of catastrophic losses. So those in 586, was in the 1970s and 73, where we started to first see like, okay, well, if we don't manage our resources because of hauling's work, we can have catastrophic losses. But it wasn't really into the 1990s where that became, resilience theory started to be used, or at least adapted and created into policies such as adaptive management and so forth. Up until that point, it mostly rested in the research realm of things. And then also in the 90s, we saw the growth and expansion of environmental management standards like ISO 14000 started to become far more common. And not just that standard, but a family of standards. So you had different ones, 14064, for example, for climate change, for life cycle assessment, eco-certification. And now there's a variety of different standards within that one umbrella that all relate to different aspects of environmental management. Eco-certification started to emerge at that point in time as well. So now into the 2000s up into the present, so the last 20 some odd years, sustainability really started to emerge as an idea, as a concept, right? So there's a much closer link between EIA and environmental management. So EIA traditionally was just you go do a project, you do all the material, all the reports and the analysis, you're done, it's over, right? Whereas, post EIA monitoring is a part of an EIA. It's what do you do once you've completed the project? And that is an ongoing systematic process, which obviously relates to environmental management. So these things started to connect more. And then also climate change started to grow as more of an important issue, at least in the corporate agenda. It's not like it wasn't an issue up until that point in time, but in the corporate world, this became something that you heard a lot more of at that point in time. CSR started to be spoken about a lot more. It's corporate social responsibility. So that's the word for kind of environmental responsibility in this era. And then standards related to CSR and sustainability started to emerge at this point in time. So this is where you had like the Global Reporting Initiative, and ISO 14001 is an example of that, but specific to sustainability. So it's not just about environment, but you deal with social performance standards and so forth and so on. Also at this point in time, we started to see the integration of cumulative effects, more public engagement, more of an adaptive approaches, all became more and more common. So with that, with the rise in popularity and the rise in necessity for these different standards was more standards. Many individual different standards emerged. So the natural step, FSC, Forest Stewardship Council, right? So if you go buy any paper in Canada today, I would say probably at least 8 times out of 10, it's going to be FSC certified. The Equator Principles, the UN Global Compact, a lot of these different things. And now there's so many of them, it's hard to keep track of them, but these are different specific standards or movements related to different kind of key issues, right? FSC is about forestry, right? The UN Global Compact is about business aligning with UN Sustainable Development Goals and UN policy. Natural Step is more about a systematic and a holistic approach to running your organization or your business, where you try and kind of treat your organization as an organism, right? It's a neat standard. So there was, in 2010 to the present, you had this massive explosion in the environment industry. So I guess it was around 2006 or so when Al Gore's film came out. And I remember, when that occurred, because I started my company in 2005. And, it was really difficult to get in offices, and I had good people to work to help me with that. And they would just be blank. They'd be like, okay, what are you talking about? Like, why does us, a bank like BMO, when I met with them, why do we need to know about this environment stuff? But once Al Gore's film came out, that's when things really, there's a massive kind of like push. And I think that had a lot of impact, and it started to get people thinking about that in more concrete terms. Tech innovation as well as cultural innovation started to drive things forward at that point in time. So you started to see renewables becoming a serious thing at that point. Not at that point economic as certainly as they are today. They're far more economically favorable today than they were then. But then also we saw the refinement of standards. So we had GRI got enhanced. You had substandards in GRI. So GRI has a substandard for biodiversity, for instance, as well as other things. We had ISO 26000 for social responsibility. So again, this is a different ISO standard for CSR. Innovation in the economics and pricing of impacts. So this is where like things like TEEB, the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. So like putting a price on things like pricing pollution, pricing carbon, now what we're looking at, and then also looking at a wide scale or a kind of a general approach to pricing for looking at environmental profits and losses. That was kind of conceptualized over the last 10 years. Now it's becoming a little more mainstream. And then various integrated approaches emerged at this. One would be the corporate ecosystem valuation approach developed by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Along with that, there's a lot of more innovative partnerships. So private sector working with research groups or NGOs or IGOs or what have you. Whereas before it was pretty segregated. You didn't see that as often as you do now. It's quite common to see that. So the standards and basics, such as plan, do, check, which is the basic approach to environmental management systems, are still important, still kind of the core of things. But as things now are evolving, you can see that things like the pricing of carbon, the emergence of the notion of a green economy, and as post-COVID, it's going to be the green and inclusive economy, right? We're going to see a lot more emphasis now coming out of COVID on social inclusion, right? So who's being left behind will be definitely much more of a priority than it has been before, because we've seen people being left behind. So the green economy, the blue economy, I think is really kicking on right now. So green economy and blue economy relates more to the ocean economy, sustainable ocean economy, and the low carbon economy will continue to impact EIA and EMS. So you're going to see, I would expect, more of these standards kind of embodying these principles, right? So I'm sure, for example, we'll be seeing the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, as a standard incorporating more social factors, I would think, right? Technology is driving the means of monitoring, managing data, and reporting. So there's a lot more emphasis on that. So we have much more capacity to store more data, retrieve it, and analyze it in a much more efficient way. When I first started on that stuff back in the 90s, like you had like a 586 computer, with, a couple megabytes of hard drive space. Now we have, huge, like I look at my plug-in drive, it's like, a terabyte or whatever. It's incredible what we can, the amount of capacity we have for data storage and analysis. And then with AI as well, our analytical capabilities are getting quite a bit significantly better. So new innovations are reshaping the economy itself in various different ways. So energy, agriculture, infrastructure, and so forth. And it's pretty interesting to see how that's going to impact what we do in our jobs. So the present, so where are we at now? So what's hot right now? At least what do I think is hot right now? Climate change clearly dominates the landscape of environmental concerns today. It's the issue that is at the forefront of most of the news. Certainly it's the issue that most political parties or politicians will come out on, at least in their environmental side of things. They, you don't see them going to debate biodiversity conservation, right? That's not going to be their lead in. Like they won't come out as this, like we are the strongest for biodiversity conservation. That wouldn't make political sense for most political parties right now, because people want to hear what you're doing with climate change, because that's the issue at the fore of most people's radar, the average person. Now the word for sustainability though today, which is relevant to all of us, is in the business context is what I'm seeing anyway, is migrating more towards this ESG, environmental and social and governance factors or programs. So that really is replacing CSR. Like, I really have not heard corporate social responsibility much for the past, 5 to 10 years. And what I'm hearing a lot of these days is this, like, okay, what's your ESG program? What are your ESG frameworks? What are your ESG indicators? Now in the so that's in like operational context. Now in the policy context, the things that we're hearing a lot of now are climate resilience and net zero growth. So net zero is, you're hearing it now, you're going to hear more of that, and climate resilience or climate action. So here's some links that I think are useful to take a look at as to like evidence. That's my hypothesis of where things are at, but here's the evidence. So this is Canada's climate change program. They've also shifted gears and certainly paid more attention to the circular economy and the idea of the circular economy. There's also here the Sustainable Development Program for the federal government, and then the new Environmental Assessment Framework and Program. So we have new legislation and then a new process for impact assessment. All of these are, newish from various different timeframes, but all have been created within the last few years. So it's kind of interesting to see how much progress has been made, at least on new ideas on this front, whereas before that we didn't really have much progress. In fact, it could be even regressive. So those are some things that I think are show that this pattern is true. And then at the international side of things, we have, these are the places where I think you can go to see where things are moving. So climate change, like, where is climate change right now? Well, we have the Paris Agreement, which was kind of launched in 2016 and is now it's in full effect. So countries are doing what's required of the Paris Agreement for those that signed on to it. And so what we'll have is a COP in Glasgow in November. So it's in a few months. There's going to be a Conference of the Party meeting for Climate Change Convention. And at that point in time, you can expect to see a lot more news, particularly with respect to what's happened in the United States, right? So you've had a change in government in the United States. So America is going to come out very strong on climate change in November. Like, they're building up to that. So you will see them making a big, lots of noise in November. And they're doing a lot of the foundational work right now. Domestic policy, international policy, kind of shifting their direction from where it was before. But they will make a point of coming out, mark my words, Joe Biden will be there, and he'll be there with John Kerry, and they're going to just be banging the American drum about leading on climate, for sure. So I'd expect this to be a very big COP. There will be a lot of significant things happen, and largely because of just the change in political dynamics and the jockeying. There's always this jockeying between countries. So China wants to look like it's a leader, and America really wants to look like it's a leader right now. And Canada will go there and try and look like we're nice people, and not try, but we'll just want to look like we're doing our part. So it will be a significant one. So I'm rolling out of the COP. I think you'll see some pretty interesting things on the climate front. So I would keep tabs on that, because that will then trickle down to what happens in the different countries. And also tech will follow that as well. So a lot more emphasis, a lot of the renewable energy sector is going to fly going forward. Biodiversity, so CBD. We heard from David a few weeks ago, David Ainsworth. So they're at a critical time right now as well, the CBD. They're just finishing 20-year plan. So the targets for the HE targets, which were developed in 2011, which were global goals for the world for biodiversity, expired at the end of 2020. That was their ending point. So now they're coming up with the post-2020 framework. And as David had mentioned, if you didn't see it, you can see I'll go to my YouTube channel and look for David Ainsworth and CBD and watch that. He talks about they're going to be, they learned a lot. They were successful in some respects and unsuccessful in many respects. And so they're going to try and address those issues. And what's interesting with that is the private sector seems to really have woken up to biodiversity. So a lot of really neat things are happening in that front, because you have an active private sector. You have the time where all the parties internationally have to come together again and come up with new goals for the next 10 years, I would expect. So they're going to look for 2030 or 2035. I don't know what their deadline is. I would expect it's probably 2030, so 10 years, in alignment with the SDGs. And you also have some tricky issues, right? And David did mention some of those ones with genetic sequencing information, like this whole technology influencing who owns what, right? So if you go to a country and grab some leaf and then sequence that information and have that, who owns that? Whereas before, with the Nagoya Protocol, you could get permission for getting samples, but you weren't able to go and get the genetic information and basically, deconstruct what that is. And now we can do that with the technology we have. Hence the problems with that. So there's some big issues, but there's a lot of opportunities on the biodiversity front. So I really keep a close eye on that, because coming out of this year, we will have a new framework, which I think will be much more, you're going to see a lot more interest from an engagement with the private sector, whereas before it was kind of a boutique thing. That's what I liked about it, because only really cool companies were engaged with that and everybody was doing climate change stuff. Whereas now I think it's going to get a bit more mainstream, which sucks in a way, because, then it's not as like, wow, it's kind of cool when it's just a boutique thing and unique. And now I think it will become more mainstream. And then the third one, land degradation, which is the UN Convention for Combating Desertification. They're kind of the sleeper of the three. Not a lot of people talk about them, but there's a lot of interesting thing happening there, because land is where everything comes together, right? So you have climate, you have biodiversity, you have food security, you have economic development, all that kind of stuff really intersects at the land. That's one of the most kind of evident place where these things come together. And so the UNCCD has always been kind of the third, the third cousin who's hasn't got all the money or the attention. What I would expect, though, that is the sleeper now. That is the area where you're going to see a lot of unexpected advances. I think it would be interesting to keep an eye on that. Canada is a signatory to the Biodiversity Convention, right? So their secretariat is in Montreal. So their headquarters is in Montreal. So we're deep in the CBD. We're like partners. We're a big supporter of them. And we have signatory and party for years, ever since the beginning. Climate Change Convention. We are a signatory. We're now, with our current government is far more engaged with the UNFCCC. Land degradation, we just recently re-engaged with them. We were actually not a party to that convention during Harper's years. I don't know if he signed off of it or what happened, but we signed back onto it in, I believe it was 2017. We became a party again. So that means doing the reports and doing all the stuff that's required for that convention, and then attending the COPs. So Canada's kind of new or back in that fold, but I would expect there's some neat things are going to happen in the land degradation realm of things too. Land restoration. The goal for UNCCD is to achieve net zero land degradation by the year 2030. So we've got a 10-year goal there that's carved in stone. That's the goal of net zero land degradation. So if you add up degraded land and restored land, it's like equal. There's net zero. And so but we're at a deficit right now. We've got a lot of degraded land we need to kind of restore. And the last one here is the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which probably a lot of you are familiar with because it gets a lot of the attention these days across the board. And the SDGs are a series of targets. If you go to that website, you'll be able to see what they are along different lines that evolved from the Millennium Development Goals, which originally were more focused on, actually more focused on poverty alleviation and these kind of things, the MDGs, whereas the SDGs took a broader approach and incorporated climate, biodiversity, and various other factors as well. So all of the SDGs have sub-targets within them and indicators, and the countries that have signed on to the SDGs are obligated to produce a voluntary national review, a VNR, every couple years or so, which outlines how much progress they're making with those targets. So Canada does it, and then countries I work with do that as well. And the SDGs are interesting because everybody talks a lot about them, but the reality is they're kind of vague. Like if you look at the SDGs, although they're detailed, they are vague in their practice in the sense that a lot of countries are still figuring out what data to use to report to what indicators that make sense for the SDGs. This is the stuff that my team and I do. So when we go into a country and say, okay, well, what do you got? What kind of data you're gathering for forests or this or that? A lot of the times it's like, well, we don't have anything, right? You know, for gender or whatever it might be. So there's a lot of work that really needs to be done in the SDGs from purely like a data standpoint, an indicator standpoint. It can be quite loosey-goosey sometimes, and depending on where you are. Nonetheless, though, it is a goal. It's a framework that most countries recognize and are working towards, and something to certainly to keep an eye on. And then also, private sector is paying a lot of attention to the SDGs. So I expect that in the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, are set for 2030. That is when we have these goals that we're hoping to achieve or aiming to achieve by that date, end of year 2030. So that means we're kind of close to the middle of the cycle. I guess it was around 2013 or something like that, where they kind of got put into motion. So now you can expect to see a lot of effort being put into the SDGs by countries that are committed to that over the next 10 years. So all of this stuff speaks to opportunities for people like you, because you have the skills and the knowledge to effectively work on this stuff and help advance these things. I mean, that's why you're at Royal Roads, because we're specialists in this stuff. So I'm doing this talk largely not just to give you a history lesson, but to show you where things came from and then where things will go. So what's the future then? Well, where will things go? I remain optimistic. Like a lot of people are pessimistic about the world going to crap or whatever. I'm pretty optimistic, like considering what I've seen shift. I'm largely because public opinion has shifted. I think on the whole, public opinion has really shifted, and also the markets have shifted. So what I've seen particularly over the last couple of years, you're starting to see major shifts in how capital is allocated and the requirements for capital allocation that seriously take into account sustainable development. Like they want to see, very good ESG frameworks, and they simply won't invest in things that are going to have a negative impact on the environment. A lot of companies, even energy companies in Alberta, who haven't really paid attention to this stuff, are having difficulty raising capital outside of just the normal constraints to that. But even if they're like, okay, look, we've got a great business plan and a business case and a lot of upside to what we're doing, if they don't have good attention being paid to the ESG side of things, they have more difficulty these days. So countries and organizations in power also seem to legitimately care about the future of the planet. Now, I'd say, although, albeit in a self-serving manner, like this is back to the anthropocentric versus ecocentric, I don't know many countries that come out with like purely ecocentric, like we believe in nature first. A lot of it is practical in nature. They recognize the need for, a strong economy in the future. So what we can expect, in my opinion, are more refined policies. So more specific, like a lot of these things are nice, but more specific and precise policies, like along this, like more precise pricing on carbon and how that's going to take place in Canada and elsewhere. I think we're going to see more businesses are going to push to drive change on certain fronts. Climate for sure. I also expect to see that happen on the biodiversity front from what I've seen over the past 10 years and also what I'm seeing now from firsthand accounts from people that I like, from companies I deal with, and also folks like David and colleagues who work with multiple different groups and companies that are, really trying to do progressive things. I also think that we can see more from NGOs and civil society. So I've alluded to this before, of the role of NGOs and civil society as part of the plural economy, which is what Henry Mintzberg kind of coins, this kind of economy where it's not just about the private sector and the public sector, so government and the private sector. You've got these in-between pieces, which are comprised of community groups, NGOs, cooperatives, unions, and so forth, I think they're going to play far more of a significant role. I think they're very powerful. And we've seen that with the Me Too movement. I think we've seen it with Black Lives Matter, just how powerful and effective social movements can become, which are largely driven by organized people in civil society organizations, right? So NGOs and civil society, I wouldn't sleep on them. I think they're going to have a far more important role. And I hope they do, because I think they're effective catalysts for change. And then also, I think we're going to see technology go where human creativity wants to take it. Like, we can't really control that too much. I mean, look at things like, who knew we would have like TikTok as a software app where people kind of like dance to songs, becoming like the craze. And I mean, it's just, a lot of this stuff is just driven by human curiosity and human desire to create and do stuff, right? And it's a hard thing to kind of predict, and it's a hard thing to control. And I think it will just happen. However, I do think the norms that surround that, right, the social and cultural norms, will make sustainable development a more prominent part of that process. So a lot of the innovations that will occur will be in that kind of umbrella of, look, we saw that ocean plastic was a big issue, and we decided to create a company that would use that plastic to create clothes, right? Or what have you. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that stuff happen in the guise of sustainable development. At least I hope so. So your future, lastly, where do I see you guys going? I see you go where you want to go. And the great thing about today is, I think there are far less barriers in terms of what you can do, how you can work, and your reach as an individual or organizing with other groups. Companies are far more flexible with how they'll work with people, right? So hence this whole, the Zoom economy and so forth. And then I think also barriers are being dropped down more, right? So I think there's more collaboration between different groups, whether they be community groups and private sector or what have you. And whenever you get that kind of liberated approach to communication, and the way things are done are not carved in stone, that to me then presents opportunities for individuals to express their agency, right? So I think it's a great time to be in this field, and I'm not just saying that because, I'm trying to sell you on being an environmental professional. I think you're already bought into it because you're taking the course. What I'm trying to say is that there's tremendous opportunities that are out there. Often it will require you to do some detective work and have a bit of persistence to hunt around. And what I would suggest for that is just to talk to as many people as you can. That's very key, to network with folks, and not network as in the kind of, hi, how's it going? Go to a, whatever, I mean, you know what I mean? You don't have to be cheesy about it. You can just follow your interests and reach out to folks and do research and try and see what's going on with different groups. And then where you find your fit, you'll find your fit, but just be open to that. So there you go. That's what I have to talk about tonight. Anybody have any questions? One thing is, if you look at the time frame, that's the other thing. So the kind of the modern environmental movement started, as we saw, in the late 60s and into the 70s. So that's, say 30, 50 years, 2020. And it took a while for a lot of those things to happen, like a good 10, 20 years for, 10, 15 for policies to start to form, legislation. But then, I mean, you start to see from, say, the 90s up until now, a much greater acceleration of development of these ideas. So I predict that we will see even a greater acceleration of these ideas. So therefore, you're going to see more policies and laws and regulations be created in response to the problems we're going to confront and are confronting. And then also all that's associated with that. So when there's new policies and social concerns, what follows that are, new types of organizations, new types of research, new tech, new stuff, right? So the rate at which these things will occur, I believe, will happen quicker than it has over that time frame. You saw like a relatively slow start, which started to get faster and faster and faster. And now we're moving into a time where we've got, obviously, the pressure is on us to change. And then also, I guess the tools are there for us to change as well. So anybody got any questions? Anybody going to go buy Rachel Carson's book? I'm a practical optimist, you know, like I'm not a blind optimist.
David, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is Karen. I was just wondering, you mentioned earlier about how companies like Dow were developing environmental management programs that they really, sort of turned their act around. Do you think they were acting in good faith, or were they being mandated to do that by increasing pressure from the government? I'm just curious because Dow has a pretty bad reputation, at least in my mind. So I was just interested to hear that. So
I don't think they were doing it in good faith.
No, okay.
No. I don't want to paint them as like saviors. I mean, had they done it in good faith, they would have gotten way ahead of the situation. I think they did it out of necessity. And there was pressure. I mean, I don't specifically know what how they're legislated, but I mean, the public pressure alone on them, like Nestle, here's a good example. So has Nestle tried to become a leader in responsible palm oil because they think it was, they felt like they wanted to be like good people? No, the answer to that is no. Nestle even came up with the idea of responsible palm oil, or at least championed that idea, because they got slammed by Greenpeace when they got nailed through a campaign that outlined that the palm oil they were using was coming from a company that was deforesting large tracts of land, which was pristine orangutan habitat. And once they got slapped with that media campaign, the whole world turned against them, and they did a 180-degree turn to try and turn that tide. So it wasn't as if they were leaders up until that point in time, and then, and then just kind of came up with that. They did it out of necessity. Now, in their defense, I don't think they had, I don't think they were necessarily knowingly doing that. It seemed as though they didn't have a good handle on their supply chain. It was their supplier. Nonetheless, they're responsible. And give you another example, British Petroleum, BP. So BP, interestingly, has always been kind of progressive as an energy company on the environmental front. Like, they've had fairly good environmental management systems and done a lot, like Shell as well, on some respects, had really tried to push the envelope. They had a lot of really smart people working for them. And I, in fact, used British Petroleum's CSR program in 2010 or 9, I think it was 2009, as an example to an energy company that we were working for to do their CSR program and say, look at what BP is doing. And then within 6 months, they had a major spill in the Gulf of Mexico, correct? Like, BP had an offshore oil well just blow up basically and had a massive spill, and they didn't handle it well. Like, they didn't handle the Deepwater Horizon. They didn't really handle the response to that well. Like, they just didn't respond effectively and as well as they could, and it hurt them badly. And what's interesting about that is it's not like they had not been doing stuff before. They had actually been doing pretty good stuff, yet they got smacked, right? So public opinion just can be brutal. So even though they were doing some good stuff, they kind of messed up on the public relations side of that situation. A, there was the accident, but B, they didn't really handle it in the best way, and their CEO got fired, and they just developed this reputation at that point in time, which is kind of like the Exxon of the 90s, or sorry, Exxon of the 2000s, Exxon Valdez of the 2000s. So I don't think that most companies are necessarily, unless of course you are, I don't know, Patagonia, right? Which I legit think is, I legitimately believe that Patagonia is trying to be a game-changing company, for sure think they're trying to do that because their CEO is fully committed to that. Similarly, Interface Carpets, who their former CEO, he's passed away now, but they legitimately wanted to change their business and be net zero. And it wasn't about them kind of like being forced to do that. They had a motivation to do that. So I think you need to really look at the leadership and what factors are influencing the organization from making the decisions they're doing, and then what they do. Like, what is it they actually do to advance that cause? And you can do that for countries as well. Like Canada is, comes out with, all these policies and so forth, and yet, when it comes down to execution of certain things, we're not doing that well, right? So on certain fronts. And so you need to look at what they're doing, at least from their management systems or their policies, and then what follows that. Like, what is the accountability that follows that? Does that answer your question? Does that kind of give you a fair assessment of what I think about that? Any other questions? Puma is another great company to look at. They want to be leaders on this front, and their parent company wants to be now their parent company, Kering. Kering, I think is how you spell their parent company. For those in 560, which is coming on in later June, we'll look closely at these things. Any other questions? Oh, question here. I appreciate sharing your optimism and how you see business driving positive change. I wonder if you happen to see the new corporation yet. The sequel to the corporation would be interesting. I haven't seen it, actually, so I can't comment on that. Is that from the same group that did the corporation? So is it Joel something or other? He's a law prof at UBC, who was originally behind the first. Yes. Okay. Yeah, in the corporation, I mean, he's got an interesting hypothesis in that he views them as like the psychology of a corporation, in the sense that they're like, they've got motives and psychological inclinations, and in some cases like perverse inclinations, in the sense that they're, I think he phrased it as psychopathic or something like this. I forget the word he used, but he really kind of put it in those terms. Yeah, like the psychopathic companies. And there are companies out there like that, believe me. I've run into them before, and they're just like crazy. But I mean, the world's becoming more transparent. I think that's another big thing, is it's a lot harder to hide these days. I mean, I don't know if you saw the news the other day. Yesterday I saw it, how, what's it called? What's that? Those hackers. What are they called? You know what I'm talking about. The group, they got a name for themselves. They're hackers. Anonymous, that's it. There we go, Anonymous. So Anonymous if you Google this Anonymous video, excuse me, Anonymous came out with a warning to Elon Musk. I don't know if you saw it. Anybody see this yesterday? I don't know if it came out yesterday, but I saw it yesterday. So they've explicitly come out and called out Elon Musk. You should check it out. So those groups, I would not mess with Anonymous, I'll tell you that, because they'll like find a way to get into your hard drive and whatever, like they'll just, as a company, like they can really mess you up, and or as a person even too. So what they came out is, and they exposed some stuff. I hadn't heard of this. Like a lot of the profitability of Tesla is largely coming from government subsidies for green energy, all this kind of stuff. The pressure that they put on their supply chain, like you think of Tesla as this company that is, greening the world, right? Whereas you look at their supply chain and the pressure that they're putting on the sources of rare earth minerals that they need a lot of for batteries and all the kind of stuff that goes into the cars. I mean, there's pretty nasty stories that are associated with that from what I've seen so far. And I know that for sure Tesla has not been a leader in environmental management systems. Like they have not published at least last time I checked, they didn't put out their sustainability report where you had all the greenhouse gas emissions and what they're doing to kind of green their supply chain, unlike other companies like Puma's and even like the major car companies, Ford and so forth, have pretty good environmental management systems in place. And Tesla has, last I checked, has not. So, and they called him out big time on this kind of hypocrisy, and which, you know, I thought was kind of cool in a way. You know, and the crypto stuff, there's a lot of, you know, I don't want to get into weird conspiracy theories, but like his influence on the crypto market is significant based on his kind of, you know, his use of social media. So this, my point is that, you know, we're in an era where there's a lot more transparency and clarity about what's what. It's a lot less opaque than it was back in the 90s when the corporation was coming out, where you had these kind of monolithic companies that could do a lot of stuff and do it without being checked, right? I'll check out the new one. I have an idea what they're probably saying, but you know. Good. All right. So there we go. I think something to chew on tonight. For those in 586, was kind of good, kind of wrap up, I think, to what we've been talking about to some degree, at least putting it in historical context. This is going to be the last Tuesday session of this series, and then it's kind of, you know, time off for the summer. For those, however, those that are in 322, it's not like we're not going to have like, you know, discussion sessions. We'll do it, but it'll mostly be focused on the course. It won't be on like a general topic. I need to take a couple months off of this to recharge for the fall. But in the fall, there will be a new series come up, and it'll be new and improved. There's going to be like kick-ass speakers. I'm going to take everything to a whole new level. I think it worked well this series. We had some good speakers, I thought, and I hope you enjoyed some of the folks that I was able to bring in. I'm going to get even more of them and better, like, and then even do a few ones we'll have multiple, you know, like we'll have a couple experts on something, and we'll just basically have a jam session on certain topics. So I'm going to work on that over the summer and then prepare a new program for a set of 8, which will come out in September. So if you're interested in that, you know, you'll have a chance to sign up to the distribution list for that, and you can free to attend that in the fall, and share it as well if you wish. All right. Okay, well, thank you for coming out, and I will see you on Moodle.